By the time I reached the edge of Lake Huron National Forest, the sky was a half-melted wash of gold and violet. The sun dipped behind the tall pines, and the water shimmered like glass cracked by light. I parked the car, switched off the engine, and for the first time in months, heard silence. Real silence. Not the city's version, filled with sirens and restless neighbors, but the kind that sits heavy in the air, deep and unbroken. I wasn't running away from the world, though it might have looked that way. I was just tired of pretending to fit in it. The breakup had been messy but quiet, the kind that leaves you hollow rather than heartbroken. My ex Claire had said all the right words, that we'd grown apart, that it wasn't anyone's fault, but we both knew the truth. I'd stopped feeling anything long before she left. The laughter had turned into small talk, the affection into routine, and through it all, I'd kept smiling, convincing everyone that I was fine. Out here, under the open sky, I didn't have to smile. I could just be. I pitched my small green tent near the lakeshore, close enough to hear the gentle lap of waves. The air smelled like pine resin and damp earth. A few stray embers from someone else's abandoned fire pit caught the breeze and died out before they reached me. I sat on the cool ground, unrolled my sleeping bag, and just stared at the water until my reflection blurred into the surface. It was strange how being alone could feel so full. By the time I got the campfire going, the stars had begun to scatter across the darkening sky. I roasted a few marshmallows half-heartedly and made a poor attempt at instant noodles. The smoke clung to my sleeves, the firelight catching every thought I'd tried to bury. Somewhere between the crackle of wood and the soft whisper of waves, I started thinking about everything I'd left behind. My apartment, my deadlines, the endless messages from people asking how I was really doing. The truth was simple. I didn't know who I was outside the noise. I crawled into the tent later, listening to the wind rustling through leaves. The lake's rhythm, that steady lap and hush, felt like a heartbeat older than mine. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. Morning arrived as a pale haze. Dew clung to the grass and sparkled in the early light. I stretched, stepped out barefoot, and breathed in the crisp scent of wet soil. The forest felt alive, humming softly. Birds calling from somewhere unseen, the breeze teasing through branches. I made coffee on my portable burner, the bitter aroma wrapping around me like an old friend. For a while, I just sat by the water, sipping slowly, watching the mist lift from the lake to reveal a reflection of sky so blue it almost hurt. Maybe this trip was working. Maybe I was starting to find that quiet I'd been chasing. By late morning, I packed a small bag and set off along the shoreline trail. The path wound through wildflowers and patches of sunlight filtering between tall birch trees. Every few steps, the ground shifted from soft soil to smooth rock, the kind that held warmth from the sun. I walked for hours without seeing anyone. Just me, the rustle of wind, and the gentle hum of the world existing without needing me to do anything. When I finally looped back toward camp, the day had grown warmer. The air shimmered with heat, and the lake reflected the sky in soft ripples. I was halfway to my tent when movement caught my eye. A figure walking along the beach, coming from the far end of the shore. At first, I thought it was just another hiker, but as he got closer, I realized he wasn't just passing by. He was heading straight toward me. He was tall, maybe in his early 30s, a little older than me, with sun-bronzed skin and the kind of easy stride that comes from spending too much time outdoors. His backpack hung loosely over one shoulder. Sweat glistened across his shoulders, catching the light in a way that made the whole moment feel strangely cinematic. He lifted a hand and waved. "Hey, man!" His voice carried easily across the still air, warm and casual. "Sorry to bother you. Mind if I ask a favor?" For a second, I froze. The sound of another person's voice after 2 days of solitude felt almost intrusive. Sure," I said, shifting my weight slightly. "What's up?" He stopped a few feet away, smiling with an open, apologetic kind of charm. "I forgot to pack sunscreen," he said, pulling a small bottle from his pack. "Been hiking all morning and I think my back's starting to fry. Mind helping me out?" "Just the bits I can't reach," I blinked. It was such an ordinary request, and yet it felt oddly intimate. Two strangers, nowhere near civilization. One of them half shirtless under the mid-morning sun. Yeah, sure, I managed, trying not to sound as awkward as I felt. "No problem," he grinned, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Thanks, man. Appreciate it. I'm Jake, by the way." "Noah," I said. "Nice to meet you." "Likewise." He turned slightly, holding out the bottle like a peace offering. For a moment I hesitated, bottle in hand, heart ticking faster for reasons I couldn't quite name. Then I squeezed out a bit of lotion and started. The cream was cool against my palms, His skin was warm, sun-hot, and smooth beneath my fingers. I moved carefully, trying not to overthink the motion, spreading it evenly across his shoulders. "Sorry," I muttered, aware of how ridiculous the whole situation probably looked. "Never thought I'd be doing this today." He laughed, easy and genuine. "Hey, you're saving my skin, literally. You're doing great." His tone was light, teasing, but there was something grounding about it. Something that made the whole thing feel less strange. The air between us shifted, subtle but undeniable. My hands paused for a second longer than necessary before I pulled back. "All done," I said quickly, wiping my palms on a towel. He turned halfway toward me, meeting my gaze. His eyes were bright, that deep ocean color that seemed to hold sunlight at the edges. "Thanks, Noah. You just saved me from a week of regret." I chuckled. "Happy to help." He slung his backpack back on, still smiling. "Guess I owe you one." Then he started walking down the beach again, the breeze ruffling his hair as if even the forest didn't want to let him go. When he disappeared past the bend, I found myself standing there longer than I should have, staring at the trail where his footprints pressed faintly into the sand. My pulse was still a little uneven. I told myself it was nothing, just the shock of human interaction after days of isolation. But as I sat back down by the fire pit, my hands still carried the faint scent of sunscreen and sun-warmed skin. The forest around me hadn't changed. The same birds called, the same waves lapped at the shore. But somehow everything felt different, like something had quietly shifted. Not in the world, but inside me. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the lake as the light shimmered across its surface. Maybe it was just the heat. Maybe it was something else. All I knew was that, for the first time since coming here, I wasn't entirely alone anymore, and I wasn't sure whether that thought comforted me or scared me. After Jake disappeared down the shoreline, I tried to convince myself it was just a passing encounter, one of those odd moments you tell people about later with a half-smile. Funny thing happened while I was camping, that sort of story. But as the afternoon stretched into early evening, I caught myself glancing toward the bend in the beach more times than I wanted to admit. The forest had that late-day stillness where even the wind seemed to rest. I was slicing vegetables for dinner, an ambitious attempt at campfire stir-fry, when movement caught the corner of my eye again. Jake was back, this time carrying a portable stove and a small fishing rod. He paused when he saw me, a grin tugging at the edge of his mouth. "Hope you don't mind," he said, nodding toward the empty patch of sand nearby. "The wind's calmer on this side. Figured I'd set up camp here for the night." I shrugged, trying to sound casual. "It's a free lake. You're welcome to it." "Appreciate it," he said, setting his bag down with a soft thud. "Promise I'm not here to steal your peace and quiet." I almost told him that peace and quiet had started to feel a bit overrated. But instead, I just smiled. "You're fine. Just don't snore." He laughed, that easy, open kind of laugh that makes the air feel warmer. Within minutes, he had his small tent pitched, and the faint sound of music drifting from a small speaker, something acoustic and mellow. It blended with the rustle of trees and the gentle lap of the lake like it belonged there. For a while, we existed in parallel silence, two strangers orbiting the same space. But as twilight crept closer, Jake wandered over holding a tin mug in one hand and a guilty smile on his face. "Caught absolutely nothing," he admitted, holding up the empty fishing rod. "So dinner's going to be instant noodles and disappointment. You hungry?" I laughed. I was about to say the same thing, minus the fishing rod. "Well then," he said, crouching near my fire. "Instant noodles for two?" It was strange how natural it felt. How quickly the space between us stopped feeling like a gap. He stirred the pot with a stick, pretending to be a professional chef, while I tried not to laugh too loudly. The smell of broth and smoke mixed with pine resin. Every now and then, he'd glance up and smile in that quiet way that made it hard to look away. Between mouthfuls of noodles, we started talking. About small things at first, the weather, the hike, the way mosquitoes seem to have military strategy. But then, like all good conversations that happen under open skies, the words began to deepen. "So," I asked, "you just travel, no fixed place?" He nodded, leaning back on his hands. "Pretty much. I do freelance photography. Mostly nature. Lakes, coastlines, the in-between places people drive past without noticing." His eyes reflected the firelight, soft and thoughtful. "There's something about quiet places. They don't lie to you," that made me smile. "What do you mean?" He stirred the fire absently. "People pretend. Nature doesn't. The sun rises, the rain falls. No explanations, no performance. I like that." I sat with that for a moment. It was simple, but it hit deeper than I expected. Maybe because I'd spent most of my adult life performing without even realizing it, pretending to be the person everyone expected. Reliable, controlled, normal. "What about you?" he asked suddenly. "What are you running from?" The question startled me. "Who says I'm running?" He tilted his head, smiling faintly. "No one camps alone by Lake Huron just for the view." He wasn't wrong. I didn't answer right away. The flames flickered between us, painting his face in gold and shadow. "Just needed a break," I said finally. "From everything." He nodded, not pushing further. "Yeah," he murmured. "Sometimes silence is the only thing loud enough to hear yourself think." We talked until the stars came out. The sky a black ocean scattered with light. I didn't realize how late it had gotten until the fire burned down to glowing embers. The air turned cooler, the kind that carries both the scent of smoke and the weight of unspoken things. Jake rubbed his neck, grimacing slightly. Guess I overdid the hike earlier. My back's on fire again," I smiled. "You really need to invest in sunscreen that doesn't rely on strangers," he chuckled, holding up the same small bottle from earlier. "Funny you say that. I happen to have some right here." He waved it like a guilty offering. "One more favor?" I pretended to sigh but nodded. "Fine, but this is officially the last time," he grinned. "You're a saint." He turned around and sat cross-legged by the firelight, facing the lake. I poured a bit of lotion into my palm and started to spread it across his shoulders again. The air was cooler now, and the lotion made his skin glisten under the flickering light. My hands moved slower this time, tracing careful circles across sun-warmed skin. His shoulders shifted as he breathed, steady and unguarded. "Thanks again," he said quietly. "You've probably saved me from a miserable night." "No problem," I murmured, focusing too much on not focusing. "Happy to help," he let out a soft laugh. "Most people would have said no by now." "Maybe I'm just polite," I said. "Or kind," he added, voice low. The word lingered longer than it should have. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, just dense, the kind that hums between two people when neither wants to move first. My hands hesitated a little too long near the base of his neck before I pulled away. "All set," I said quickly, capping the bottle. Jake turned, eyes catching the firelight. There was something in his expression I couldn't name. Not expectation, not gratitude, something in between. "You're good company, Noah," he said softly. "Didn't think I'd say that about anyone I met in the middle of nowhere." "Could have fooled me," I replied, smiling despite myself. He stood, stretching, and the moment dissolved like mist in sunlight. "Well," he said, "here's to strangers who can cook and save your back from third-degree burns." I laughed, and just like that, the air lightened again. He walked back toward his own tent, stopping halfway to glance over his shoulder. "Good night, neighbor." "Good night," I called back, the word catching slightly in my throat. When he disappeared behind the trees, I sat by the dying fire for a long while, staring at the faint glow of coals. My palms still smelled faintly of sunscreen, my skin still warm where his had been close. It wasn't attraction. Not exactly. At least that's what I told myself. It was just connection. Simple human connection. Something I hadn't felt in a very long time. But as the lake shimmered under the moonlight, and the forest settled into its slow, breathing quiet, a question tugged softly at the edge of my thoughts. Why did it feel like more than that? The rain arrived without warning. 1 minute, the air was still, humid and heavy with the promise of another calm evening. And the next, the wind began to roll through the trees like a whisper turning into a shout. I'd barely zipped up my tent before the first drops hit, quick and sharp. Within minutes, the sky opened up, the downpour so loud it drowned the world in white noise. I sat cross-legged inside, listening to it drum against the canvas. Every flash of lightning lit the tent for a heartbeat, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the earth beneath me. The storm was beautiful in that way nature often is. Wild, indifferent, unstoppable. It should have made me feel small, but instead, it made me feel present. Somewhere outside, faint over the rain, I heard a voice. "Noah, you still dry in there?" "Jake." I unzipped the flap halfway, and there he was. Soaked through, hair plastered to his forehead, a wide grin cutting through the downpour. He was holding an extra tarp over his head, though it clearly wasn't helping much. "Barely," I shouted back. "Mind if I crash in there till it passes? My tent's about ready to float away." Before I could even answer, another flash split the sky, followed by thunder that felt far too close. I stepped aside instinctively. "Get in before you become a lightning rod." He ducked through the entrance, shaking off rain, laughing under his breath. Water pooled near the flap, the scent of wet pine and damp earth filling the small space. I reached for a towel, passing it to him. "Thanks," he said, rubbing his hair, voice softer now that the storm muffled everything else. Didn't mean to invade your space. You're fine, I replied. It's better than listening to that storm alone. He smiled, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain hammered down harder, the sound constant, hypnotic. The tent felt impossibly small now. Our knees nearly touching, our bags pressed together in the corner. I could feel the warmth radiating off him, even through the damp chill. Jake leaned back slightly, eyes on the fabric roof. You ever notice storms make everything honest? I frowned a little. Honest? Yeah, he said, his voice low. You can't fake anything in weather like this. The noise strips everything away. All the things we pretend don't matter suddenly do. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. I just listened. To the storm, to his breathing, to the strange calm that had settled between us. After a few minutes, he spoke again, quieter this time. Can I tell you something without you thinking it's weird? I looked up. Sure, he hesitated, rubbing a hand over his jaw. I've been traveling alone for years, met a lot of people, stayed in a lot of places, but I can't remember the last time I met someone who made silence feel comfortable. I wasn't sure I understood. I mean you, he said simply. You don't fill the air just to kill it. You just exist, and somehow that's enough. The words hit deeper than they should have. I'd spent months surrounded by people who expected noise, conversation, performance. To be told that my quietness, something I'd always seen as a flaw, could be enough felt strange and disarming. I smiled faintly, though my voice came out rougher than I expected. You give me too much credit, he shook his head. No, I don't. Thunder rolled again, and for a second the light flared, showing his expression clearly. Open, uncertain, but honest. I looked away quickly, pretending to adjust the lantern. My pulse was doing strange things again, and the air inside the tent felt heavier. When the thunder eased, Jake's voice dropped even lower. You know, when I asked you to help with the sunscreen that first time, he paused, exhaling slowly. I told myself it was just practicality, but that's not really true. I glanced at him, unsure where this was going. What do you mean? I noticed you, he said. Before that, when you were walking along the shore that morning, you looked like someone trying not to break. The honesty in his tone startled me more than the thunder ever could. I wanted to deflect, make a joke, anything to lighten it, but I couldn't. My chest felt tight, my throat dry. I didn't think anyone could notice that, I said quietly. He smiled faintly. Sometimes it takes someone who knows what it looks like. The tent went still. Rain softened to a steady patter. Jake's gaze stayed on me, not demanding, not prying, just waiting. I swallowed hard. Jake, I've never... The words tangled. I wasn't even sure what I was trying to say. He shook his head gently. You don't have to explain. I'm not asking for anything. Then what are you saying? He looked down at his hands. That I feel something, and I don't want to pretend I don't, even if it scares you. Even if it scares me. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I should have said something logical. Something that set boundaries. But logic felt very far away. Instead, all I could do was listen to the rain and the quiet between us that suddenly felt charged. The air smelled of pine and rain and warmth. Jake's arm brushed mine, barely. But it was enough to set off a rush of awareness that traveled through me like static. He didn't move away, and neither did I. He whispered, It's okay, to just be here. No definitions, no explanations, just be human for a while. Those words, be human, hit something in me I hadn't realized was hollow. For months I'd been holding myself together, performing recovery, pretending to be fine. And here, in the middle of a storm, someone was quietly telling me it was okay not to have answers. I let out a shaky laugh. You make it sound simple. Maybe it is, he said softly. Maybe we just make it harder than it needs to be. Another flash of lightning filled the tent, and I saw him clearly again. His eyes half lit, his expression open but uncertain, like he was standing on the edge of a cliff and waiting to see if I'd step closer or walk away. I didn't step closer, but I didn't pull away either. Instead, I just let the silence do the talking. The storm outside became background, a rhythm, a pulse. While inside the small tent, the world narrowed to warmth, breath, and the kind of stillness that felt like truth. I could feel his presence beside me, solid, grounding. After a long pause, he shifted, his shoulder brushing mine again, this time intentionally. He murmured, You okay? I don't know, I admitted honestly. I think I've been holding my breath for a long time. Jake nodded slowly, his voice a whisper. Then maybe tonight's the night you finally exhale. I didn't answer. I just let the words settle. Let the sound of rain fill every space between us. Something unknotted inside me. Not understanding, not clarity, just release. We sat like that for what felt like hours. Two people who didn't know what to call what they'd found, but who no longer needed to name it. Outside, the storm began to fade, the thunder rolling away into the distance. Inside, everything had changed, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in the kind of quiet that redefines you without asking permission. When I finally looked over at him, Jake was watching the rain slide down the fabric wall, his expression unreadable but calm. He caught my eye and smiled quietly, almost
not a
shy,
question, not
as
an
if it
answer,
didn't want to
just
disturb whatever the
understanding.
night had left behind. The storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean. Dew glittered on every blade of grass outside the tent, and a pale mist hovered over the lake like breath that refused to fade. For a few moments, I lay there, unsure whether I was awake or still somewhere in the space between dream and memory. The steady rhythm of rain had been replaced by birdsong and the occasional soft creak of trees stretching after a long night. My eyes drifted open to see the faint outline of Jake beside me. He wasn't touching me, just close enough that the warmth of him lingered in the narrow space between our sleeping bags. Something inside me stirred, half peace, half panic. It wasn't what had happened between us, because technically nothing really had. It was what it meant, the quiet honesty of it, the way my body had stopped fighting itself for the first time in months, the way his presence had made the storm feel less like chaos and more like truth. I turned onto my back, staring up at the thin canvas roof, tracing the faint watermarks from last night's rain. That's when the guilt crept in. Not sharp or immediate, but slow and heavy, curling in at the edges. Not guilt about him, not really. Guilt about me. About the version of myself that had been so tightly defined by expectation that this kind of openness felt like betrayal. I'd spent my life being what people needed. Dependable son, steady boyfriend, the one who had his life mapped out in neat, respectable lines. And now, lying in a damp tent beside a man who had quietly peeled those labels away without asking for anything, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I sat up carefully, not wanting to wake him. The air inside the tent was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and rain. Jake's breathing was steady, unbothered. There was something almost peaceful about it. I envied that peace. I wanted it for myself. Slipping on my boots, I stepped outside. The ground was soft beneath my feet, the forest alive with that post-storm glow. Everything washed and gleaming. Mist still clung to the water, and sunlight filtered weakly through the treetops, turning droplets on branches into tiny stars. I filled my lungs with air that smelled like wet soil and renewal. For a second, I closed my eyes, pretending that I could breathe clarity along with it. But clarity doesn't come that easily. The guilt followed me as I walked along the trail. Each step squelched softly in the mud. I didn't have a destination, just a need to move, to think, to let the forest absorb what I couldn't yet understand. I told myself the night before had been a mistake, something born of loneliness and the strange intimacy storms create. But even as the words formed in my head, I knew they weren't true. It hadn't been confusion. It hadn't been weakness. It had been something real, something honest. The kind of connection that doesn't ask for permission or promise. It just happens. That thought terrified me. I stopped near a ridge that overlooked the lake. From up there it looked small, calm again, pretending it hadn't just endured a night of thunder and wind. I sat on a smooth rock, elbows on my knees, staring at my reflection in the water far below. My face looked the same, but something behind it had shifted. "What are you doing, Noah?" I muttered under my breath. The forest didn't answer. It just listened, the way nature always does, patiently, without judgment. I thought about all the versions of myself I'd been over the years. The Noah who smiled through dinner conversations, even when he felt invisible. The Noah who worked late to avoid thinking about the cracks forming in his relationship. The Noah who kept saying I'm fine because it was easier than explaining what he didn't understand himself. Maybe this trip had never been about getting away from the world. Maybe it had been about getting away from that Noah. When I finally made my way back to the campsite, the fire pit was cold. The tent flap was open. Jake was gone. A sharp panic shot through me before my eyes caught the folded piece of paper tucked under my water bottle. My stomach tightened as I reached for it, fingers trembling slightly. The note was short, written in neat, careful handwriting that somehow felt exactly like him. "Noah, you don't owe me an explanation. Just be honest with yourself. Jake." That was it. No apology, no pressure, just quiet understanding. I read it twice, then a third time, the words blurring slightly as my throat tightened. I wasn't sure what I was feeling. Loss, gratitude, confusion, maybe all of it tangled together. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even sad. He just understood something I hadn't yet learned. That running from yourself doesn't change who you are. It only keeps you tired. I sat down by the dead fire, the note still in my hand. The lake shimmered under the growing sunlight, scattering into 1,000 golden shards. It was beautiful in that effortless way nature always is, honest and uncomplicated. I envied it again. Hours passed without meaning to. I made coffee, though it went cold before I remembered to drink it. I skipped stones across the lake, watching the ripples spread until they disappeared. Each ring fading slower than the one before, like a quiet metaphor for how change really happens. At some point, I thought about Claire, the person I'd been before all of this. How we'd built something stable, respectable, but never really alive. I remembered sitting across from her in restaurants, smiling, pretending. Both of us knowing something was missing. I'd mistaken comfort for connection, habit for love. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't mine either. But maybe that emptiness was what had led me here. To this lake, this storm. This stranger who had quietly reminded me what it meant to feel awake. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time I noticed movement down the shore. Jake was there, kneeling beside his half-packed tent. He was folding his tarp, his camera bag already slung over his shoulder. My chest tightened, that familiar mix of relief and fear washing through me. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stood and started walking toward him. He looked up at the sound of my footsteps, his expression unreadable for a moment, then softened into a half-smile. "Hey," he said. "Didn't mean to vanish. Figured you needed some space." "I did," I admitted. "And I think I used it to hide." He tilted his head slightly. "How'd that go?" "Terribly," I said, the honesty catching me by surprise. "Turns out I'm not as good at pretending as I thought." He didn't answer right away, just watched me with that same steady patience that had unnerved me from the beginning, the kind that saw past words. I pulled the note from my pocket, holding it up. "You're right. I don't owe you an explanation, but I owe myself one." He nodded for me to go on. I hesitated, then said quietly, "What happened last night? It didn't confuse me. It woke me up. I don't know what to do with that yet, but I think that's the truth." Jake's shoulders eased, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Truth's a good place to start," he said. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of pine and rain that hadn't yet fallen. The world felt suspended between endings and beginnings, waiting for one of us to move first. He turned toward his tent again, his voice low. "I'm leaving in the morning, heading north. Got a shoot lined up on the coast." I nodded, trying to ignore the ache that formed somewhere deep and quiet. "Of course you are." He looked back, meeting my eyes with a faint smile. "Doesn't have to be goodbye, you know. It can just be, until next time." The simplicity of it broke something open in me, a small, fragile kind of hope. I nodded. "Until next time." He smiled again, soft and real, before turning back to finish packing. I walked back to my own camp as the sun dipped behind the trees. The lake shimmered like liquid gold, and the last of the light stretched across the surface like a bridge I wasn't quite ready to cross. I sat by the fire pit and unfolded Jake's note one more time. His words were simple, but they carried weight. Be honest with yourself. That night, as the stars blinked back into view and the forest hummed with crickets, I finally understood what he'd meant. The truth wasn't about labels or answers. It was about letting go of the version of myself that had been living for everyone else's comfort. And as the fire burned low, I realized that honesty didn't always start with words. Sometimes it started with silence. Dawn came softly, like it was afraid to wake the world. The mist rose from the lake in pale ribbons, the sky washed in the faint blush of early light. Everything smelled clean, pine, damp earth, and the faint smoke of last night's dying fire. I stirred in my sleeping bag and felt that familiar emptiness before memory filled it. Jake's voice, his note, the conversation by the shore, the quiet honesty that had hung between us like a thread neither of us had dared to pull. When I stepped outside, the campsite was still, my breath fogged in the cool air. Across the clearing, Jake was already awake, kneeling beside his half-packed gear. His tent was down, his bag zipped tight. It hit me then. He was really leaving. "Morning," I said, my voice rough. He turned, smiled faintly. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." I hesitated, then nodded toward the lake. "You heading out?" "Yeah," he said, tightening a strap on his pack. "Long drive north. Magazine wants sunrise shots on the coast tomorrow." There was no bitterness in his tone, Just the easy steadiness of someone used to moving on. That should have made it easier. It didn't. I opened my mouth to say safe travels or take care, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, what came out was, "You're really going then?" He nodded, hoisting the bag over his shoulder. That was the plan. I stood there uselessly, hands in my pockets, watching him check the buckles, adjust the straps. Something about the sight, the calm, practiced efficiency of leaving, made my chest ache. He looked up when he noticed I hadn't moved. "Hey," he said softly, "you okay?" I wanted to lie, to nod and play it off, but I was tired of pretending. "Not really." He waited. "I need to say something before you go," I said, the words coming rough but steady. He straightened, one hand resting on the strap of his pack. "Okay," I stepped closer, heart hammering. "I don't know what last night meant or what we are. I don't even know what I'm supposed to call any of this. But I know I don't want to act like it didn't matter." He didn't interrupt. His gaze stayed steady, open, patient. I swallowed hard. I've spent my whole life trying to fit into a version of myself people could understand. The version they could love without asking questions. But what happened here? It didn't confuse me. It didn't break me. It just felt right. And that's terrifying. But it's also the first thing in a long time that's felt honest. The silence after was thick, but not heavy. The world around us seemed to hold still. The lake like glass, the wind caught in its breath. Jake's expression softened. The smallest trace of a smile at the corners of his mouth. "You don't have to know what this is, Noah," he said gently. "You just have to stop running from what it feels like." "I'm trying," I whispered. He nodded slowly, as if that was enough. Maybe it was. Then, with a quiet breath, I said the thing I hadn't planned to. "Stay one more night." Jake's brows lifted slightly. "Not for anything dramatic," I added quickly. "Just let this breathe. Don't end it with goodbye." For a heartbeat, I thought he'd say no, that he'd smile kindly and walk away. But then he exhaled, his shoulders relaxing. "One more night," he said softly. "I can do that." We spent the day as if time had loosened its grip. The sun rose higher, burning away the mist. We took the canoe out onto the lake, gliding over water so still it reflected the clouds like another sky. The oars dipped soundlessly, leaving soft ripples that spread and disappeared. Neither of us talked much at first. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was something else. Full, like a conversation made of glances and shared rhythm. Jake sat opposite me, camera in his lap, the light painting his face gold. "You ever wonder how many moments like this people miss?" he said suddenly. "Just because they're afraid to stop moving?" I looked at him over the paddle. "All the time," he smiled. "Guess we got lucky then." Guess we did. We paddled until our arms ached, then drifted near the shore, letting the boat rock gently. Jake handed me his camera. "Here," he said. "Take one." I lifted it, unsure what I was supposed to capture. He looked straight at me then, not posing, not smiling. Just there. Real. I pressed the shutter. The click echoed faintly across the lake. When I lowered the camera, he was still watching me. "You're a natural," he said. "Hard subject to ruin," I replied before I could stop myself. He laughed, a quiet, genuine sound that rippled through the moment like sunlight on water. That evening, we built another fire. The flames crackled low, throwing soft orange light across his face. The forest had settled into its nightly rhythm. Crickets, the sigh of wind through the trees, the lake breathing against the shore. We talked about everything and nothing. The roads he'd traveled, the cities I'd worked in, the people we used to be before we started listening to what the world wanted instead of what we did. Somewhere in between, the conversation turned quieter. Jake poked at the fire, sending up a spray of sparks. "You know," he said, "people think finding yourself means being alone. But sometimes it's just meeting someone who makes silence feel like home." I looked at him, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "That's what this feels like," I said before I could second-guess it. "Like home." He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. The distance between us had already changed. Small, steady, familiar. When the fire burned down to embers, we didn't say goodnight. We just drifted back to the tent, not as strangers, not as something we could label, but as two people who had finally stopped pretending. We lay side by side, the sound of the forest wrapping around us. His hand rested near mine, our fingers barely touching. No declarations, no promises, just quiet warmth. It wasn't about romance or definitions. It was about truth, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to be real. Morning returned in gold and silver. The sunlight filtered through the tent, painting lines across the fabric like brushstrokes. Jake was still asleep beside me, one hand tucked under his head, the other resting loosely near mine. His expression was calm, peaceful. I watched him for a moment, feeling the ache of something both ending and beginning at once. Then softly I whispered, "Maybe I came here to find myself. Maybe I found someone who showed me who I could be." He stirred, blinking sleep from his eyes. "What was that?" "Nothing," I said, smiling. "Just thinking out loud," he smiled back. "Dangerous habit." "Yeah," I said. "But maybe it's time I stopped keeping everything in." We packed slowly that morning. Not because we had to, but because neither of us wanted to break the spell of that quiet. When everything was loaded, we stood by the lake one last time. The reflection of the sky shimmered in the water, the same and yet different. Jake turned to me. "You sure you're okay?" I nodded. "Better than I've been in a long time. Still figuring it out, but I'm not afraid of it anymore." He smiled. "That's enough. That's everything." He opened the door of his truck, then paused. "Where are you headed after this?" I shrugged. "Maybe nowhere for a while. Maybe somewhere I haven't seen yet." He nodded toward the passenger seat. "Plenty of space if you want to start with north." For a second, I hesitated, that old voice in my head whispering all the usual questions. What does this mean? What will people think? But then, quieter, another voice answered. The one I'd started listening to the night of the storm. "Be honest with yourself." I smiled. "North sounds good." The road curved along the lake, sunlight flashing between the trees like old film. The air smelled of salt and pine. Jake drove with one hand on the wheel, window down, wind tossing his hair. The radio hummed softly, catching fragments of songs between stations. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. As the campsite disappeared behind us, I looked back once, at the tents, the water, the trail where two strangers had crossed paths and quietly changed each other. I didn't know what waited ahead, or what we would become. Maybe that didn't matter. Maybe it was enough that, for the first time, I was moving forward without pretending. Jake glanced over, catching my smile. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, watching the horizon unfold in gold. "Yeah, I am." The road opened ahead, wide, bright, and endless. And somewhere between the shadows and the sunlight, I realized freedom wasn't about escaping the world. It was about finally belonging to myself.